All right, let's talk about display grid and what it actually does underneath the hood. Okay, just a quick overview. Right now, I have two inline elements, the span and the anchor, right? They're next to each other because they're inline. If you didn't know, inline elements cannot have things like margin top or padding top. If I do this, it stays in the same place, right? But if you go to its container and you do display grid or display flex, whoops, display grid, now it's converted to a block element and also a grid item. So now it can get the margins. Okay, cool. Now I'm just gonna uncomment everything here, and then we can move on with our example. Okay, so let me delete this. So just by putting display grid, all of our children items are now grid items, right? That means everything's put into one column from here to here, and as many rows as we need. We have 8 items, so we have 8 rows. Okay, but what's the point of this? Display grid is meant to use as columns and rows. So how do we get our columns? Well, on your container, you do something like grid, template columns. Now, let's just say I want one column, 500 px. Cool. 2 columns, second one, only 100. Nice. Okay. Also, you have something like repeat. How many times do you want to repeat? 2. How big each column? 1 FR. So now we have 2 FRs because it repeated 1 FR twice, like this. Cool. Now, when you declare it this way, that means you want 2 columns no matter how big it gets. See? What if you want CSS to decide for you how many columns? And also, if you have like 100 items, how do you do that? Well, you can still use repeat, but instead of a number, we're going to use autofill. And then we'll do the min-max function because you cannot use 1 FR in conjunction with autofill. Okay? Because autofill is not an integer. Okay, so min-max, minimum, let's just put 250 and maximum 1 FR. Let's see what we get. Okay, so what min-max does is it's taking, hey, your minimum value and your maximum value. It's going to try to find a value in between or a little bit lower, depending on the padding, the margin, the content inside each div, and so on. Okay, so this is what we get. Now, if I make this bigger, we get more columns because we used autofill. How cool is that, right? And we get smaller, we get more rows too. Okay, but the bad thing about this is that what if sometimes you just want it to be like 2 columns no matter what, right? Okay, so let me show you something else. Instead of this, we can also do something like fit content 25%, and then fit content 75. Okay. So this also creates 2 columns, but each column, it's fitting all the content, but only making the column 25%. See? So the right side is 3 times as big as the left side. And this is useful. Let's say all of your left side are titles of books, and your right sides are short summaries of the book. Okay, now that that's done, let's move on to something else. Okay, so we have columns and rows. We have the first item and the last item in blue. How do we switch an item in grid, right? And how do we make an item take up more space in grid? Let's do that first. Let's do the more space. So this yellow one, I want it to span the columns, rows. I want it to get taller. So we're doing rows. We want it to go from row 1. Right now it's ending at 2, but we want it to go all the way to 4. So we can do grid, row, start at 1 and end at 4. Okay, you see that it didn't go all the way down, but rather it created extra rows, right? Because it took into account that, hey, if I extend all the way to row 4, right, this should be pushed here. And then it changed all the widths and height so that everything still looks even. What happens if we do 3? Yeah, see, looks a little bit different too. And then that actually moved this guy to the left. Okay, so you got to be careful with what you're trying to do. So now let's learn about switching. Let's move this yellow one down to where this blue one is. So how do we do that? Well, first, when you move grid items, you need to move by rows and then by columns across. So we want it to start from row 4 and end at row 5. So grid, row 4, 5, and then grid, column. Where do we want it to start? We want it to start at 2 right here and end at 3. And you see that it got moved over here. And this moved the blue to the left, right? So now we can just say that the blue will start at grid, row 1 and 2. See? So now we switch them, and the sizes stayed the same after it figured out everything. Right? Now, what happens if we want this blue one to spread all the way across? How many items do we have? So let's delete everything. Let's spread the gold one across. Grid, row 1 to 9, because we have 8 items. Okay, so now you can see that it's pushing all the way down. Okay, what did we do? Grid, columns 1 to 9. Oops, grid, column 1 to 9. Okay, you see that it's moving 1 through 9, but it changed the height because CSS realized that, hey, you don't need it to be so high if it's just on top, right? So then this is what happened. Let's see if we delete that. Okay, we get everything normal again. And just by using all of this basic stuff, you don't even need grid template areas. You can solve most layout problems. And also, just so you know, you can have grid containers or grid childs that are also flex containers or another grid container. Okay, so right here, you see all of these are grid items, the grid child. But if I do display grid, inside of them, they're now also grid containers. And then I can do something like place items center. See, this got centered, that got centered, everything got centered. Yeah. Just by using place item center. So in conclusion, the outer container has display grid, and its grid children are all of these divs, right? The yellow box, the blue box. But each of these divs or boxes are also its own grid container, okay? So an element can be both a grid child and its own grid container. So since this is a grid container, who are its children? Let's go here. So we have container, display grid. So then all of these are grid children, but they're also their own display grid. Okay, so the text content inside are now the grid children. Therefore, place items will work on them, so they get centered. And you can have infinite. Okay? You can even have display flex. Okay? Justify content center. Okay. Now, if you use display flex, you have to use like align items to center vertically as well, and it doesn't look as nice as the display grid. Right? Cool.